I have to admit to you that a couple of weeks ago, I felt a little bit like one of the characters from the Hebrew Scriptures, because I encountered three angels who visited me one morning with a message. And they did not visit me in an encampment outside of a city somewhere or on a rock like Jacob by the river. They visited me on the way to LAX airport. I guess that's where you experience angels now. In the matter of only about an hour and a half in the morning, I had three encounters which felt especially holy to me and left me walking out of those moments feeling a little bit different. I've been traveling for one reason or another the last few weeks, and I was getting out of a hotel room in the morning, prepared to get a flight early out of LAX airport, and I got on my phone and got a Lyft driver to come and pick me up. When I got picked up, I got in the car. It was early. I hadn't had coffee yet, and I wasn't in the mood for a big, long conversation on the 35-minute trip to the airport, but the driver was. And over the course of that 35 minutes, the man who was driving me to the airport began to confess. He started telling me about his struggles in his marriage, about his inability to remain faithful to his wife in his marriage. Gave me a list of his affairs, described the physical struggles that he felt like he was undergoing, the way that he was structuring his work life to reduce temptations. A very detailed account. We got to the airport, I got my bags out, a little stunned. Put my bags down and waited to say goodbye, and he turned and said, "Hey, thanks. It felt really nice to talk for a while and just to have somebody listen." You're welcome. Have a good day. I got my bags, I went into security, put my stuff on the x-ray machine, I was walking through, I got to the other side, ready to get my cup of coffee. And I heard someone saying, "Is anybody in the terminal a Spanish speaker?" And the question again, is anybody in the terminal a Spanish speaker? Is anybody in the terminal a Spanish speaker? I'm thinking to myself, we are in an airport, we're in LAX, we're in California, there's somebody else. A few minutes go by, I reluctantly raise my hand. Yes, I'm kind of a Spanish speaker. So I kind of helped another person, a man from El Salvador who was lost, trying to find his niece from El Salvador, a child who was also lost in the airport. She was fleeing violence in her home country that you may have heard a lot about in the last few years. They didn't have cell phones. She was a child. He didn't know how to find her, but he knew that she was in the airport, or she was supposed to be. So I struggled and got him where he was supposed to be, reunited him with his niece. It just turned out that their gate was one over from mine. Kismet, fate. I was ready for my cup of coffee. Went to the restroom to wash my hands, get my phone charged in, get my cup of coffee, and when I walked into the bathroom at the terminal in LAX, I saw a little infant child being bathed, I guess. Blessed, definitely. Small child, a naked infant being held by two elderly men, gently dripping water over the baby and bathing him in the sink of the men's room in an airport terminal at LAX. An unlikely spot for a baptism. But I just kind of stood back and watched as these men lovingly and prayerfully bathed this little child. I finally got my coffee and sat down at the terminal and tried to reflect on the last hour and a half. I had been visited by the uncle, the Son, and the Holy Spirit of the Lyft driver, blowing where it listeth. I sat down and reflected that all these encounters felt really precious and sacred to me. I felt like I had experienced something of our human dependence on one another, of this utter need and embodied sense. A man who felt like he couldn't control his body, a lost human being trying to find another lost human being who couldn't speak the language, and a utterly dependent naked child being bathed in the bathroom of an airport. It occurred to me in that moment that none of those holy encounters required that I wear the label that I so often wear when I expect to have holy encounters. Minister. If I were to pick a short list of the labels and names that I think represent me, if you asked me, who are you? One of the 3 or 4 top answers that I'm going to give you is minister. It forms an understanding of my life's meaning and depth, and yet in that moment, not only was that role unnecessary, but I think it actually would have been a hindrance if I had held it up as who I was. Thankfully, the guy who drove me to the airport didn't ask what I do for a living. Or else, I think when I answered him, he wouldn't have shared with me in the way that he did. My assumption. It didn't matter to the man trying to find his niece what I did. It mattered that we were in relationship. And watching that child from afar, I didn't have to be the one blessing the infant to get what was happening. Our summer book study comes from Forest Church's book called Lifecraft, and it's about how to form everyday moments of your existence into a meaningful narrative of a spiritual life. Kind of how to infuse your everyday moments with the holy. This week's chapter is on self-portraits. Basically, the idea revolves around the spiritual question, who are you? What are the self-portraits that you paint over the course of a lifetime and then proudly display to the rest of the world? This is who I am. He says that in his own experience, the question, who am I, an important one, if not handled correctly, can turn into a very narcissistic and adolescent question. Not to disparage adolescence. But that the idea is that there's a formational part in our life in which we have to define ourselves over and against something else. I am this and not this. He says that certain generations in our country would think that asking the question, who am I, searching for the real me after decades is a luxury question. He specifically talked about folks who grew up in the Depression or fought in the Great Wars, people who would say, just do what you're supposed to do. He talked about the fact that we can find ourselves as progressive people staring into the pool like Narcissus, asking over and over, who am I? Who am I? Until everyone but us gets annoyed. Last week at our annual conference of Unitarian Universalists, our minister emerita, Laurel Hallman, who was the senior minister of this congregation for 2 decades, reflected on that question, who am I, in a way that made it a little more enriching for me. Reverend Cantor presented her in front of the gathered group of thousands of us with the equivalent of a Lifetime Achievement Award. It's called the Distinguished Service Award to the cause of Unitarian Universalism. After Reverend Cantor presented her with the award and sat down, Laurel got up and gave what is the equivalent of an acceptance speech. And in it, she reflected that over the course of her life in ministry, she lost herself from time to time, as happens to anybody, and that she would bring herself back with these Ignatian spiritual disciplines out of the Catholic tradition by asking herself the question, who am I? And then following it immediately with, who else am I? Who am I? Who else am I? She mentioned a practice that she set up, a reflective practice to do in groups that my colleagues and I have done, where you sit down in front of another person in a chair and they look you in the eyes, and for 5 minutes, this happens. Who are you? Then you give an answer, and the person responds, God have mercy. And then they ask you again, who are you? Then you respond, and they say, God have mercy. The God have mercy part is something she said some Unitarians initially went, to, but she said, just do it. It'll do the work. The idea is to disrupt any notion that the label I just put out into the world is the end all of who I am or who a person should be. I'm a minister. God have mercy. I'm a father. God have mercy. I am a skilled person in my trade. God have mercy. We've done that exercise as colleagues in the Southwest District of our association, and it is actually more uncomfortable than it sounds, if that can happen. But to me, the operative question in what Laurel was saying, the thing that made that search for my identity, our identity, useful, was the additional question, who else are you? The implication being, you really think you're just that thing? There's a lot of good studies that show that the labels that we wear radically change the way that we move in the world. The decisions we make, the risks we're willing to take, how people perceive us. And if you don't think that's true, the next time somebody asks you what you do for a living and you've never met them, try the experiment of telling them you're a minister. You will see that 8 letters, 1 word, can radically change your relationship with a person. Either they're about to tell you the deepest secrets of their life or run away screaming, put down their drink and stop telling dirty jokes, or pick up your drink and tell you dirty jokes. That's true enough. A lot of studies that show that using noun verbs over adjectives, noun words over adjectives, change who we think we are. So, for example, how many of you plan to vote in November? Thank you so much. Now, how many of you are voters? So the question actually changes whether or not you'll actually vote. Both in California and New Jersey in recent years, universities have studied that if you ask a person a week before an election, can I count on you to vote next week? It's one question. But if I ask you, can I count on you to be a voter next week? You are 10 to 15% likelier to vote if I ask you if you're going to be a voter. Because now it's not a thing I do, it's who I am. It's my identity. I am in that long tradition of the fraternity of the voter. And I have to keep voting if I'm going to maintain my identity. The same actually proved true with whether or not you like chocolate. So how many of you like chocolate? Okay, thank you. The suspicious few among you who didn't raise your hands. But if you put a person under an MRI scan and ask them that question, their brain lights up just a little bit. But then if you ask them to say the words, I'm a chocolate eater, that part of the brain starts flashing more intensely. Something about finishing the words, I am, with something is more powerful to a sense of who we are. If that's the case just with eating chocolate or voting, can you imagine what the long-term effects are of the labels, identities, names, self-portraits that we paint for ourselves or others paint for us and we carry and display our whole lives, proudly saying to the world, this is who I am. Think of how powerful those names can be, even the most freeing ones, or how constricting they can be. I am an addict. I am a convicted felon. I am a parent. I am a survivor. I'm a widow. I'm a patient. I'm a grieving parent. Even the best, most life-giving, full expressions of who we think we're supposed to be can be constricting if we think we can only ever be that. I think it's only when I truly believe that I don't have to be a minister that I get to be a good one. If I feel trapped in that identity, I don't think I'll ever do a good job. The same with being a spouse or a parent. Think about the labels we wear, specifically progressives sometimes. I am a good person. That's great. And yet, if I show that picture to the world, I am a good person, I am going to be ignorant of the ways that I am causing harm in the world. Because I can't cause harm, because I am a good person. And in the long run, every single one of those portraits we have worked so hard to paint, every single label that we have held up that is I am to the world is going to be a temporary one. No matter what you think about the afterlife, the collection, the constellation of atoms that bears your name and every single self-story you've ever told about it is a temporary thing. If the Big Bang is true, then you and I were all literally the same thing once. And then when we give our bodies back to the earth and they disintegrate and become the soil, once again the collection of atoms that bears your name will be something else again. The collection of building blocks that I like to call Aaron right now has been dinosaurs and palm trees. It has been saints and sinners, dictators. It has been trash heaps and symphonies. And will be again. And the more tightly I cling to any one of those stories as the great I am, the less possibility I think I'm actually going to have while I'm still alive. At our conference last week, one of our colleagues spoke at the last worship service of the gathering and said that one of the temptations of a liberal church that very rightfully welcomes all of us as we are is that we could fall into the temptation that the goal is to be welcomed as we are at the door and then never change again. That the great narrative we tell, that who you are is welcomed here, which is absolutely 100% true, could turn into a congregation of people who show up wanting to be served for exactly as they are and then get upset when they don't get what they want. And it'll never happen, right? One of the things I love about this church is that it doesn't fall into that trap all too much. But the reason that we're welcomed into the door just as we are here isn't necessarily an end in itself, even though that can be a life-saving thing. Here we hope that once you figure out an answer to the question, who are you, the next question is, now what? What are you going to do with that self that you've just discovered in the service of healing and making the world more whole? How are you going to use that identity to be a builder of beloved community on earth? Because every time you answer that question, the next question is the same question. Now what? How will you use the I am you have to be a builder of heaven on earth? How will you contribute as a participant in the great story of healing the world? I think it behooves us to be mindful of the self-portraits that we proudly display for the rest of the world to see. You'll know it's happening when you use the words always and never a lot. She always does that. She's such a I would never because I'm a. Those are good cues. When I attended a Baptist church in my adolescence, one of the things we heard a lot was the phrase that every saint had a past and every sinner has a future. I understand those words a little differently now, but I believe them just as strongly. The great hope of my religion at that time was that at any moment your life could turn around. You could be infused with the Spirit of God's wisdom right then and there on the earth that would change what you were capable of. And it's still true. Whoever you think you are, whatever label you put on yourself, however grandiose or limiting, whoever you think you are and whatever story you're telling about yourself, it's not the end of the story. Who else are you? It's true for others too, unfortunately. Every person that enrages us or frightens us, every person whose mere existence works like sandpaper to take away our rough edges, they are also not only who we believe them to be. And therein lies the great hope. The great hope of what it means to be a limited, fragile, temporary creature. The story is not over yet. No matter who you think you are, there's something else to discover. May it be so, today and all days. Amen.